Our next speaker, Dr. Terrance Wapshall, who has been a working clinical psychologist since 1978, taught at the University of Toledo for 9 years, I think, and since 1993 has also been a Jungian Analyst, which, as my own career path, again, I have a vested interest in. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Terrance Wapshall. Please give him a hand.
By nature and profession, I'm more of a listener than a talker. So if at some point I lapse off, just give a shout. When I was thinking about this talk, I kind of wondered about what the title should be. And if you had other Jungian analysts come, you would get a different perspective on psychopathology. So this is definitely not the Jungian view of psychopathology. But there's another word in that title that's a bit problematic. Jung was not all that comfortable with the word Jungian. In fact, if it was up to him, there may not have been any Jungians. He was very resistant to the idea of there being a training institute for training Jungian analysts. He was heard to say on a variety of occasions, is that okay? A variety of occasions that, thank God I'm Jung and not a Jungian. I think what he was sensitive to was the very delicate life's work of individuation, and each of us manifesting our uniqueness, and how vulnerable and fragile we are to the influence of groups and institutions to present obstacles to that path toward individuation. Talking about Jung in a straightforward fashion is a bit complicated in the sense that he didn't develop a system of psychology in the way that, say, Freud did with psychoanalysis or Skinner did with behaviorism. He was more an essayist in a way, like Emerson. I'd like to share with you kind of a perspective that helps me have realistic expectations for this field of psychology. It's easy to be humble if you're a psychologist. There are a lot of reasons to be humble if you're a psychologist. Psychology is a very new discipline compared to mathematics, physics, chemistry. People have been involved in those studies for hundreds or even thousands of years. I think the Pythagorean theorem is 2,600 years old. By contrast, the official beginning of psychology was 1875, when Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, Germany, and William James at Harvard started psychology laboratories. That also was the year that Jung was born. Until that time, psychology had been a part of philosophy. So it's not been a field in its own right for a very long time compared to other disciplines. As a new discipline, it's prone to fads. As I go on today, I think you'll get a sense of how different fashions and points of view have waxed and waned in psychology. Another challenge for psychology is the complexity of its phenomenon. Each human brain contains about 100 billion neurons. Each neuron can be connected to up to 10,000 other neurons. Now, there was a time when we thought that we pretty well understood the behavior of each of these neurons. You may remember from some of your courses that on one end of the neuron there's the dendrite tree that receives excitation from neurotransmitters. The excitation moves down the cell body to the axon, which releases more neurotransmitters into the synapse to adjacent dendrites and so forth. But some recent evidence, study at Northwestern University indicates that neurons can also aggregate and delay firing. They've also observed axon to axon stimulation as well. So even at this very, very basic level, the elemental unit of the brain, we're still learning more things about the complexity of this basic neuron unit. Here's another big number, 10 to the 87th, and as you'll know from how exponents work, that's a 1 with 87 zeros. That's the number of elementary particles there are in the universe. Here's a bigger number, 10 to the 100 trillion. So a 1 with 100 trillion zeros after it. That's the number of possible different states that one human brain can be in. It's staggering, isn't it? It's the most complex thing we know of in the universe. And that's just one of us. So if you multiply that by, I guess there's over 6 billion of us now. So psychopathology, sometimes Jungians are big on looking at the etymology of words to try to get some perspective or understanding. So there are 3 parts to the word: psyche, which is often translated as soul or mind, sometimes breath. It's also the word for butterfly. So the middle of the word comes from pathos, suffering, pain, disorder, despair. And the last part is logos, for word or naming or order. So in the second and third parts of the word, you see kind of an antithesis in a way. If we're talking about disorder and order, there's a kind of an irresolvable tension that the word itself risks coming apart. If you, for a moment, have an image of a butterfly in your mind, outside, flitting from plant to plant, collecting pollen, very unpredictable movements, almost like our brains. It's very hard for us to predict what our next thought is going to be. It's very hard for us to predict what kind of breath we're going to have next. Is it going to be just like the one that was before or the one after? So one way to study butterflies is to observe, to film, to try to somehow take into consideration its movements. Another way to study butterflies is to stick pins in them and put them on a board. So psychopathology and its study has a problem similar to the one that we see in quantum mechanics. The phenomenon that we're studying is very much affected by our method of observation. So if we think about a researcher or a therapist addressing a person with psychopathology, a great deal depends upon the attitude in which they bring to that situation. A true desire to understand, a true desire to help a person express what their experience is, express what their pathos is, can sometimes reduce suffering. However, if a researcher or a therapist somehow has a fear response or some negative response to pathos, then they might withdraw and distance, making the person with the pathology feel more alone in their suffering, perhaps. The primary reference for psychopathology is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual from the American Psychiatric Association. The first version came out in 1952. It had 130 pages. It had 106 diagnoses. It's gone through 4 or 5 updates and revisions. We're currently on DSM-4 text revision. That came out in 2000. We're due for another one in about 2 or 3 years. The current version, the one that came out in 2000, has nearly 1,000 pages and 365 diagnoses. So I think for me this goes along with the dynamic nature of psychology, how things are changing. There's no reason to think that this rate of change and development is going to slow down or that we're approaching some final consideration. Jung finished medical school around the turn of the century, at the beginning of the 20th century. And then he went to Zurich to work in a psychiatric hospital there, the Burgholtzie. And he worked there for about 10 years, doing pretty traditional psychiatric work, seeing patients who had psychotic illnesses. The guy who ran the hospital was Eugen Bleuler, the man who originated the term schizophrenia. Until then, psychotic symptoms that we would associate today with schizophrenia was called dementia praecox. Basically, what that means is a kind of an early senility. There was somehow a belief at that time that when younger people started exhibiting psychotic symptoms, they were like old people who had dementia. When Jung was at the hospital, there was a patient there who believed that the sun had a tail and that that's what caused the wind. So around that time, there were some new discoveries in Egypt on papyrus and writings about Egyptian mythology. And Jung was interested in this and started reading it and found that there's a part of an Egyptian myth that says the sun has a tail and that's what causes the wind. Of course, Jung thought that was extraordinary, and he investigated whether or not this patient could somehow have had access to this recent find in Egyptology and satisfied himself that the patient had not had any opportunity to be exposed to that. Whether or not this patient could somehow have had access to this recent find in Egyptology and satisfied himself that the patient had not had any opportunity to be exposed to that. So this set a direction for Jung. It originated the hypothesis of the collective unconscious. That is, he began to wonder if it were possible that somehow that individuals could somehow have access to deeper layers of the species in terms of its symbols and mythology. And he spent a great deal of the rest of his life doing a comparative study of cultures, looking for similarities in mythologies and religions and symbol structures and so forth. His idea was that just as in medicine there's comparative anatomy, helps us understand from species to species similar sorts of structures, so forth, is it possible that there could be psychological structures that would be similar as well in different cultures? A few years ago, I had an experience a little bit like this with a patient I worked with in the hospital. He believed that he was Zeus, middle-aged man, and he had drawn an elaborate map of Greece, and he put in where many of the temples of the goddesses were. And then he flipped this map over, and it was a map of Ottawa. And he listed where he thought all the temples of the goddesses in Ottawa were that corresponded to the Greek goddesses. So there would be goddesses at the subway. These were women that he had run into. There would be goddesses at Tim Hortons. There would be goddesses at the Quick Mart. His primary interest, well, maybe I should say, he was very well oriented to reality in all other ways, except for this belief about his being Zeus. His main interest in talking to me he believed that I could arrange a meeting for him with a female psychiatrist he had seen a number of years before in Ottawa, and that if I arranged this meeting, he could convince her that he was Zeus, and that then she would make a public announcement confirming that he was Zeus, and then the goddesses in Ottawa would come to him. So we probably worked together for about a year. I kind of tried to understand what this symptom might mean for him in his psychology. We were able to talk about, when he was younger, had he dated, what were his relationships with females like, what was his relationship with his mother like. I tried to interest him in the possibility of dating, thinking that somehow this symptom represented some disconnection for him that he was trying to solve, some disconnection from the feminine somehow. I think that we probably would have had to work together for a long time. He was moved to another hospital in the province, and I often wonder how he's doing. Now, as I mentioned, Jung worked for about 10 years at the Burgholtze, working with people with psychotic illnesses. There's some current sort of resonance to Jung's approach, that is, trying to understand what the symptoms might mean in terms of a person's illness. Now, since Jung's time, psychiatry has moved on, and I would say the predominant point of view at this stage is that psychotic symptoms probably don't have meaning, and it's probably not worthwhile spending much time listening to the person who has these experiences, and that probably what we ought to do is find some medication that the person can tolerate that will reduce or eliminate their symptoms. But maybe 5 or 10 years ago in Britain, there's a psychiatrist named Douglas Turkington. So he and his group have developed what they call cognitive behavior therapy for schizophrenia. And what they do is they listen to the person who has a psychosis, try to understand what that psychosis is about, try to make a therapeutic relationship with the person, and eventually enlist some of their capacity for rationality to somehow develop a deeper understanding of the meaning of their symptoms. So they've had pretty good success, and the National Health Service in Britain now has taken on this approach, and they're having good results with fewer rehospitalizations, lower medication use. And Turkington credits Jung for inspiring this point of view for him and for his team. So that's kind of an interesting way that Jung is currently relevant. Another area of psychopathology that I think Jung has current relevance in is that in addictions. In the 1930s, one of the co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous came to consult Jung. His name was Roland H. About his alcohol addiction. Jung's association to this partly was that the Latin word for alcohol is spiritus. And Jung wondered if somehow there was a spiritual thirst in this man. It's kind of an example of what came to be called Jung's constructive, proscriptive approach to symptoms, thinking that the symptom was the person's best attempt to solve some kind of psychological problem they were having. And that obviously it wasn't working, but somehow maybe the symptom might point toward some future better resolution of what the problem was. So Jung recognized that Roland H. was in a hopeless situation. And he told him that he thought the only thing that might cure him was something like a religious conversion. And Jung had met with William James in 1909 when he came to the States on a lecture tour. And, of course, William James wrote Varieties of Religious Experience. And they talked a great deal about the similarity between psychological change and religious conversion. Roland H.'s situation was hopeless within the sphere of his ego consciousness. There was no answer for him, no way out of the addiction within his ego consciousness. Something needed to come from outside to break through, break in, and so forth. In 1961, not so long before Jung died, the other co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill W., wrote a letter to Jung describing what happened to Roland H. after they had this consultation, how he was able to recover from his addiction, how he and Bill met, how it helped Bill recover from his addiction, and how Alcoholics Anonymous started, and basically thanking and acknowledging Jung for that. Now, all of the 12-step programs, whether it's Narcotics Anonymous or Readers Anonymous and so forth, have some reference to the need to have some sort of relationship with a higher power, however a person experiences that. Now for this next part, as I mentioned, Jung spent about 10 years working in a pretty traditional psychiatric hospital. But then a very important shift took place in Jung's interest in psychopathology and who he thought had psychopathology. There were a number of cultural shifts, as well as a personal shift for Jung that came into play here. In 1905, Einstein's special theory of relativity came out, and he said, space and time are not fixed. Very disorienting conjecture. That is, can we believe the objective veridicality of our perceptions? At around the same time, too, the beginning of the 20th century was the advent of modernism in art, music, literature, architecture. It's when Impressionism comes about. People were literally seeing differently. Also, there was World War I. I think it's hard for us to appreciate now the kind of innocence that pervaded Western civilization prior to World War I. Scientifically, religiously, there was a feeling of confidence and certainty about the nature of the world, about the nature of ourselves, and about the nature of salvation. There were so many things about the war, from the blundering way in which the nations entered into it, the way it was conducted with poison gas, machine guns, suicide charges out of trenches, mass killing on an unprecedented scale. It was a shattering experience for millions of people in Western civilization. For the most part, these were Christian nations involved in the war. Also around this time, 1912, 1913, Jung broke from Freud. It had been a very important relationship for 7 years. Jung was professionally isolated, even ostracized during this time. He gave up many of his teaching duties at the university and his clinical duties at the hospital. It was a time of deep introversion for him. Henri Ellenberger, who wrote The Discovery of the Unconscious, said described it as a period of creative illness for him. It was the beginning of when he started the Red Book. He spent a great amount of time and energy trying to understand his dreams, his daytime fantasies. It's when he developed the technique of active imagination. And it's when he realized within himself the deficits in the unlived parts of himself that came from growing up as a West European and as a Christian. And he discovered that what is devalued or left out in Christianity is the feminine, sexuality. There's no way of including evil somehow, and also matter, the preference for spirit over matter. So these were all things that were obviously present in Jung's own experience and in the experience of the larger culture, given modernism, given the war, and so forth. So it wasn't only Jung, but there were many people in Western civilization for whom the Christian myth no longer contained their existential anxiety about the meaning of their lives. Where do we come from? Why are we here? What happens when we die? Jung came to call this period, the psychopathology of this time, as the neurosis of meaninglessness. The psychopathology of this time as the neurosis of meaninglessness. Around this time he wrote, "It seems to be quite true that the East is at the bottom of the spiritual change we are passing through today. Only this East is not a Tibetan monastery full of Mahatmas, but in a sense lies within us. It is from the depth of our own psychic life that new spiritual forms will arise. They will be expressions of psychic forces which may help to subdue the boundless lust for prey of the Aryan man." That's from Modern Man in Search of a Soul. He had been interested in Eastern mythology and religion for a while and saw it as in that the East and West were in kind of a compensatory relationship to one another. That what Western culture emphasized and promoted and allowed into consciousness were almost a mirror image of what was promoted and allowed into consciousness in the East. I think it's worthwhile at this point to talk a bit about the hypothesis of the unconscious. It has implications for psychopathology. Jung was one of the depth psychologists, along with Freud and Adler, who had the hypothesis that there was something or some process in us that they called the unconscious. Now, just kind of going back to the immaturity of our discipline, for the first 50 or so years of the 20th century, that was a widely held assumption and hypothesis, and it was used in understanding and also in treatment. The Rorschach inkblot test was frequently used. The thematic apperception test was frequently used. Pretty rare now that those tools are used. What the unconscious hypothesis addresses is the assumption that is it adequate to know only what we're conscious of for a full understanding of the way we operate or what we suffer from? Now, it's interesting. I mean, we know from cognitive neuroscience, we know from evolutionary psychology that there are many thought processes, many motivational processes which operate outside our awareness. But in current day clinical psychology, it's not a hypothesis that is used very much, or if it's acknowledged, it doesn't seem to be so important in terms of psychodiagnostics or psychotherapy. Now, it's interesting that one of the founders of cognitive therapy, Aaron Beck, was originally trained as a psychoanalyst. So in his therapy, let's say for depression, after his patients' symptoms disappeared and they did not see themselves as being depressed, did not have depressive symptoms, no longer fit the diagnostic and statistical manual of being depressed, he would ask them about their dreams. And what he would notice is that there were depressive themes, associations, narratives in the dreams. There's another line of research that tries to access unconscious processes in formerly depressed patients who have recovered and have no symptoms compared to normal controls. And what we find is also the presence of depressive themes, associations, tendencies, and so forth, in spite of the person having no conscious awareness of being depressed, nor meeting any criteria for being depressed. Now, this research is quite consistent with the frequency of relapse rates for people who have major depressive disorders. It's about 50%. So, what does it mean then that a person is not consciously aware of being depressed, but it looks like somewhere else in their psyche there's something associated with depression going on? So maybe that's one of the things that we've lost by not using the hypothesis of the unconscious now. Now, I have been comparing psychology to some of the more well-established disciplines and indicating that it comes up short in terms of development and sophistication. But in one way, physics has a problem like psychology does with the unconscious. Over 90%, over 95% of all the energy and matter in the universe is dark. We have no direct way of assessing its existence or its nature. We just infer its existence from indirect evidence, from its indirect effects. which is not a bad analogy for our understanding of the unconscious. So I'd like to turn to something that's maybe more specific about this major shift in focus that Jung had after his creative illness at midlife. If you think about schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, unipolar depression, postpartum psychosis, the severe and persistent mental illnesses, they may affect about 5% of the population, cause tremendous pain and suffering for the individuals, for families, for their communities. But what Jung focused on, partly from the cultural upheaval that he lived through, was the 95% of us that wouldn't have a DSM-4 TR diagnosis. The kind of psychopathology that goes along with there being over 6 billion of us, with technology that amplifies our impact on one another and on the planet. He saw that most of the destructiveness and mischief in the world was caused by all of us sane people. His patient, so to speak, became Western civilization and Christianity. Now, I don't know whether I'm being presumptuous here, but I think this might be a place where Jung and Buddhism overlap. Jung would see that if a person identified only with their conscious self and said that everything they were not aware of was other, he would see that as a form of psychopathology. And I'm wondering if perhaps Buddhism would as well. Now, this tendency to divide up in the world into self and other and assume that there's a firm line there is a kind of psychopathology which predisposes us to a fearful or an aggressive, destructive approach to that which is other, whether it's in ourselves, in other people, or in other parts of creation. My sense is that the way I think about this is there are obstacles to compassion. That is, when I think about compassion this way, the ability to know and feel that we are connected to everyone else and everything else. But what gets in the way of that? What are the obstacles to this compassion? And I think Jung and Buddhism both had approaches that could help us identify, understand, and kind of manage these tendencies. It's not just human beings that have stranger anxiety, that have this fear and aggression toward the other. It's throughout the animal kingdom. It's very connected with our survival instinct. So, how do we manage something that is so inborn and so vital to our survival, but at the same time puts us at risk for exterminating our species and the rest of the planet? For Jung, World War II came, the atom bomb came, and for him the only thing that stood between the continuation of life and obliteration was the human psyche. So to give kind of a concrete example, Jung talks about a concept which he called the shadow. The image basically is that that which is illuminated casts a shadow. Practically, what that means for us as individuals is that we grow up in a family, we grow up in a neighborhood, a culture, and so forth. And that culture prefers certain kinds of thoughts, behaviors, emotions, and so forth. So we learn, consciously or unconsciously, to suppress and repress aspects of ourselves which the culture doesn't want. Now, using the unconscious hypothesis, these characteristics and qualities don't disappear. They're still there, it's just that we're not aware of them. And the tendency is to, in order again to maintain this boundary between self and other, to project these unwanted negative characteristics onto others. So typically that's what happens. We project aspects of our shadow onto others. Now, I should say that for Jung, shadow could have positive or negative qualities. For example, if a person has a basically negative self-concept, a negative conscious self-concept, they may be unconscious of positive aspects of their personalities. But what I want to focus on for now is the more common situation where we think quite well of ourselves and we project whatever aspects of ourselves we don't like or feel like the other onto someone else. So I'll share with you a little dream. This person dreamt that they were in an Arab city, and there was a citadel or a kasbah in the center of the city. It had 4 gates and it was surrounded by a wide moat. And the dreamer says, I stood before a wooden bridge leading over the water to a dark horseshoe-shaped portal which was open. Eager to see the citadel from the inside, I stepped out on the bridge. When I was about halfway across it, a handsome, dark Arab of aristocratic, almost royal bearing came toward me from the gate. I knew that this youth in the white burnous was the resident prince of the citadel. When he came up to me, he attacked me and tried to knock me down. We wrestled. In the struggle, we crashed against the railing. It gave way, and both of us fell into the moat, where he tried to push my head underwater to drown me. No, I thought, this is going too far. And in my turn, I pushed his head under the water. I did so, although I felt great admiration for him, but I did not want to let myself be killed. I had no intention of killing him. I wanted only to make him unconscious and incapable of fighting. This is a dream that Jung had in 1920 when he was traveling in North Africa. This is the way he interpreted it. In traveling to Africa to find a psychic observation post outside the sphere of the European, I unconsciously wanted to find that part of my personality which had become invisible under the influence and the pressure. Traveling to Africa to find a psychic observation post outside the sphere of the European, I unconsciously wanted to find that part of my personality which had become invisible under the influence and the pressure of being European. This part stands in unconscious opposition to myself, and indeed I attempt to suppress it. In keeping with its nature, it wishes to make me unconscious, tries to force me under the water, so as to kill me. But my aim is, through insight, to make it more conscious, so that we can find a common modus vivendi. The Arab's dusky complexion marks him as a shadow. The dream reveals how my encounter with North Africa affected me. First of all, there was the danger that my European consciousness would be overwhelmed by an unexpectedly violent assault of the unconscious psyche. Consciously, I was not a bit aware of any such situation. On the contrary, I could not help feeling superior, because I was reminded at every step of my Europeanism. So this is a very typical kind of shadow dream. It's one that would come up in every Jungian analysis for a person. To integrate that, to own it, so forth. It was crucial to Jung's understanding of what we need to do as a civilization to keep from exterminating ourselves and making the planet uninhabitable. So this is the way he thought about it. If you imagine someone who is brave enough to withdraw all his projections, then you get an individual who is conscious of a pretty thick shadow. Such a man has saddled himself with new problems and conflicts. He has become a serious problem to himself, and he is now unable to say that they do this or that they are wrong and they must be fought against. He lives in the house of death. Such a man knows that whatever is wrong in the world is in himself. And if he only learns to deal with his own shadow, he has done something real for the world. He has succeeded in shouldering at least an infinitesimal part of the gigantic unsolved social problems of our day. I'm especially interested in your comments and reactions and questions. So I think I'm just going to read one quote from, this is from Jungian Analyst, a playwright, a Romanian-French playwright. Since I am not alone in the world, since each of us is at the bottom of his being, not only himself, but also everyone else at the same time, my dreams, fears, and obsessions are not mine alone. They are an inheritance handed down by my ancestors, an age-old possession and common property. So this was this writer's description of this sense of compassion, of being connected with everyone else. And most of the world's religions talk about the need for compassion. And I think Jung had one sliver of the answer about dealing with obstacles to compassion. And each of us can do our part by working with our own shadow. So I think I'll stop there, and I'd be delighted to hear what you think.
Field a few more questions if people want to jump in. Sure, go ahead.
Hi. I was hoping you could, you sort of alluded to Jung's notion of individuation, and I was hoping you could elaborate on that a little bit vis-a-vis the Buddhist notion of no self and how that might tie in together. So sort of Jung's individuation and then this idea that, you know, upon closer examination there's no true self.
Did you folks hear that okay?
Please repeat it.
Okay, as I understand it, you're wondering what the correspondence might be between Jung's notion of individuation and a Buddhist notion of no self.
Yes.
Part of this project of becoming aware of the other, of the unconscious in oneself and also that without, is to somehow find a way to relativize ego consciousness and put it in relation with the matrix from which it emerges. it's easy for our ego consciousness, I think especially in the West, to feel itself to be self-made, that it only owes itself for its existence, and that it is free of encumbrances from connections. Especially in the West, we put a high value on free will, sense of agency, internal locus of control. I'm not sure I feel so competent to kind of talk about the Buddhist notion of no self, but somehow I think there is some resonance to this project of relativizing and establishing a more proper, productive relationship between one's ego capacities, executive functions, which are necessary for life and which are the basis for personal responsibility in terms of making decisions. But at the same time, realizing that who we think we are is not the whole deal. And developing an ego that is permeable to influences from the unconscious of ourselves and from the world without. And it takes a lot of training. Jung's emphasis might be on a little bit more on personal biography to see the obstacles to that experience of no self. Buddhism's methods and approaches might be somewhat different and not necessarily so biographical. You know, is that
absolutely? Anybody else?
How does in an analytic session? Is that what you call
Yep.
it? Okay. How do you discover what the content of, as an analyst? Like, how do you figure out what is actually the shadow? What is being illuminated, and what is actually being cast as the shadow element?
Yeah. Well, I think a primary avenue is through dreams, and most of us have dreams sort of like this one that Jung had, where we're being attacked, we're being assailed by usually someone in the dream of the same sex, who is trying to harm us in some way, or at least the ego in the dream feels the threat somehow. And that relates to our conscious perception too, that when we feel as though our view of ourselves and of the world is being questioned, that feels like a threat. So in dream imagery, it's important to work with what that could be. You know, what characteristics does the shadow figure in the dream have? Is he lazy? Is he dishonest? Is he greedy? Whatever. Then we have to kind of figure out what in your personality is unable to accept those aspects of yourself. In what situations are you greedy, dishonest? So it has to do with understanding that human beings have all of these capacities and qualities. And we're better off knowing our devils, so to speak. We can save ourselves and our fellow human beings a lot of trouble if we can have a bit of consciousness in terms of doing what we do. I don't know if that kind of addresses what you're saying or not, but it takes a long time. There's often a lot of resistance to integrating the shadow, but it's absolutely essential as a very early work in Jungian analysis. And the shadow can come up at different times in different guises and so forth. And it takes a lot of learning on the part of the analyst and the analysand to learn the vocabulary of your own personal unconscious, what things mean. Yes?
Yeah.
Is there a similarity and dissimilarity between Jungian understanding of unconsciousness and Buddhist ethics on higher?
What's the second part you mentioned?
Alaya Vinyana. Some types of storehouse of consciousness, something that is called spectrum. Is it similarity between the Jungian understanding of unconsciousness and the Alaya Vinyana?
Right.
I'm not catching the second part.
It's a technical Buddhist term. Am I pronouncing it correctly? Alaya Vinyana? Right. The Buddhist notion of Alaya Vinyana and the Jungian concept of unconsciousness. Any overlap or similarity?
Yeah. I wish I could respond to that. Maybe we can kind of have a discussion later and kind of compare the two conceptions. I don't. Is someone else aware of this aspect of Buddhism who might want to comment on that?
Anyone? Fun thing probably knows way more than I do. It's in Yogacara Buddhism. It's like this the storehouse consciousness, like these various karmic seeds. They're called karmic seeds, and this is what gets carried on through reincarnation, right? And it's basically the source of all psychic life. And it's no anyone's particular consciousness. It's just a. Am I doing this properly, Bante? It's basically it's sort of the source of psychic life, and depending on the habits that are, you don't necessarily have to do reincarnation, but just depending on the habits that are cultivated throughout a person's life, they will, certain seeds will sprout. It's like, you know, when you put a seed on a table, it's not going to turn into a tomato plant, but if you put it in the right conditions, it will. Right? So it's sort of like that. Is that right, Monty?
About the only thing that's coming up in me right now is that I think for Jung, it was very important the attitude that the conscious ego had toward the unconscious. I mean, his notion was that somehow the unconscious would be a bit of a mirror in its attitude. If the conscious ego was negative and devaluing toward unconscious contents, then this is what we would see in unconscious representations, perhaps a very hostile. I mean, we could say that Jung must have been pretty hostile toward the non-European aspect of his self, or his shadow to try to kill him. That's a very aggressive kind of point of view. And I think for Jung, this was a part of individuation, a part of the work that never ended. That the goal was not somehow to identify with either the ego or the unconscious. It was a never-ending negotiation, struggle, tension between the two, because the unconscious needs the conscious ego to become conscious. So there's a lot of work to be done, and this wrestling in this dream of Jung's is a good example. Conscious. So there's a lot of work to be done, and this wrestling in this dream of Jung's is a good example of what he thought of was essential in the psychological work. It kind of echoes back a little bit to Jacob wrestling with the angel all night long in the Bible, until and Jacob in the morning made the angel blessing and survived, but he always walked with a limp after that. So he survived, but he was wounded. I don't have the feeling I'm really kind of addressing what we're talking about here, but it's what's coming up in me about Jung and the unconscious.
Yeah, no, we have time. Is there? That's a regular question.
I have those questions. You can go first.
Yeah, so I guess one like when I listen to what you say, and perhaps many people hear those too. When you hear the word unconscious, like I come from this tradition, and it's sort of it's very difficult for me to I feel like I'm listening to something old, right? You know, like something that was used to be talked about a lot, but now it's sort of, it's like hearing an old slang word, right? That seems very strange. And I was wondering, because you're a practicing clinician, and you probably daily interact with fellow colleagues who don't share your opinion on things, and certainly look at pathology. It sounds like to me Jung looks at pathology from the meanings that are in it, looks at the content instead of just the symptom. So the symptoms come from the content, not vice versa. I guess my question is how do you, when you're interacting with your colleagues, how do you encourage them, or how would you say you could encourage your colleagues to pay more attention to the content and meanings of people's psychic life in order to, because it certainly isn't emphasized in CBT. It's mainly, this is irrational, that's inaccurate, let's challenge it immediately, and, instead of work with it, and what does that point to instead?
I'm thinking part of your talk, John, about the importance of narrative, kind of overarching thing. And I think that in day-to-day clinical work, whether we realize it or not, we're trying to develop some kind of story to help us understand what this person is experiencing. And I think what happens is that my colleagues and I don't necessarily agree about how it is that we come to construct that story, that narrative for each of the patients. But my usefulness to the team and the colleagues comes out of this background in analytical psychology and informs my perceptions and observations and characterizations of what a person is going through. And I think it's very important, and I'm lucky enough to work with people who are very practically oriented in the sense that they aren't theoretically rigid in terms of their psychiatric, psychological approach. The main thing is trying to reduce a person's suffering or help them feel less alone in their suffering. And whatever helps that, that's what we're going to do, regardless of who thinks it up or why they think it up or what the theoretical background is. So I suspect that if we had, during discussions, we would differ in terms of theoretical understanding about things. But those differences really pale when you're confronted with someone who's suffering. And the main desire is to kind of alleviate that.
Sure. I'm not a therapist, but I think like the story stage I think some ideas of Jung were very prescient. Jung, one of the big differences I see it before in Jung's story is that Jung moved to the psyche as this self-organizing process, as opposed to the mechanical sort of hydraulic model, steam engine model that Freud was using. And that aspect of Jung is novel. That's very new and very prescient. And Jung's idea that a lot of this self-organization is done through a form of processing, I think, is also not old. I think it's very new in that sense. And so if we were to sort of reconstruct the idea of the conscious along in that vocabulary, I think we could make it very relevant to people who would normally not dare open the book and written by him. Just a suggestion. I think
that's a very good point. Especially about this opponent processing. Jung's basic assumption is that all living systems were homeostatic, and that there's a unending tension between high blood pressure, low blood pressure, high blood sugar, low blood sugar, and his notion was that probably takes place in the psyche too.
I think that's very possible.
One of the Bible things that we were speaking about, we were saying that one of the best things that Jung was saying that one of the best things a person can do for humanity is to confront their own shadow, and that seems very intuitive to me. But I think there are those for whom that is counterintuitive in the sense that they may say, if you want to help humanity, go out and invest yourself in the cause, give it your time. All this investment in yourself is selfish, self-indulgent, and it is really just isn't productive to anybody else, and you're just helping yourself. So can you speak a bit more about how not confronting the shadow is a danger to humanity, and how and perhaps respond to that criticism that's waged against people who maybe take on psychoanalysis or engage in meditation practice?
Yeah, I think Jung might not see those as necessarily mutually exclusive. Going overseas and working in a program doesn't end, certainly, and may actually add to self-knowledge when one confronts different people living in a different place in the world. It relativizes one's own experience and increases self-knowledge and may help us to increase our consciousness of shadow aspects of ourselves. At the same time, individual work, let's say, in analysis, will have benefits for one's colleagues and fellow human beings. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive activities, and I think it's very important that for Jung, again, because he was worried about obstacles to individuation and manifesting our own uniqueness, he would never prescribe a person's path. He would never say, look, before you go overseas and work with people, you better stay here in analysis for 5 years and work on your shadow. Because all of us have our own individual path, and only we can know what is right for our next step in our development. And many times it's only afterwards that we find out, why we made that step. So.
You said that if someone has a problem of some sort, their dreams will be a good way to kind of look at that problem and see what's bothering them. So just wondering, if the person who has a problem sees a film or a TV show or something on TV or reads in a book, that same kind of, like Jan saw Islamic guy attacking him. If he saw that in the film or something, would he have the same kind of reaction as he has to the dream? Like, would he, at least subconsciously, have some sort of a reaction to it that it kind of speaks to him, and would that speak to him in some way?
I'm not quite getting that.
If you have a dream, you see a dream as if you are starting a film, right? That's how you experience a dream in a certain way, right? Right? So if you actually see a film that has that same kind of story, that some kind of problem in it, would you respond to it?
So I think would people react to representations of their own personal shadow that they might see in a video or something? Do they have similar sorts of reactions as they might in the dream?
I would think so. If I'm following what you're saying, in this instance, Jung consciously felt himself to be superior to the North Africans that he was interacting with. And I'm assuming that if you watched a movie with North Africans in them, you might have the same sort of reaction to feel superior.
So one way to treat them would be to show them a lot of films and see what kind of reactions they have to different situations.
Well, I think that's a good point, and I think often what happens in analysis, an analysand will see a movie, read a book, witness some kind of interaction that causes quite an affective, quite an emotional reaction, and usually that's a good sign that something's going on there. You have an attachment there, or you have some kind of stuckness there. And then try to process what happened in that circumstance, because there again is, I think, the permeable layer between consciousness and unconsciousness that a person may not be aware of why or what in this situation caused the emotional reaction. It doesn't make any rational sense, but yet it happened. It's real.
So I think film can be very useful in terms of psychological work. Fellini, you may know, was in Jungian Analysis for decades and kept extensive dream journals and played out much of his own psychology in his films.
Yes, you way in the back.
Hi, sort of a side question that practice and therapy how's play as opposed to dreams, which happen to you in sleep or in rest states, whatever, you actually engage in play during the dream session and your own analysis. Rapid inquiry with all sorts of really rich imagery brought together because it seems very Buddhist, it's such a causal plot lines and so on. But it's really very dynamic Christian argument that it wasn't rational, and it wasn't, but it didn't feel like it was just straight up archetypes. And I was just wondering how play in something that sort of goes past just questions on things like meaning and so on, that seem to be just purely a witness state. Because I noticed that you seem to engage someone from beyond that, so direct knowledge. Direct knowledge is also what is called direct transmission. So how does one engage that directly as opposed to just reflective? Yeah, like play, that the development philosophy actually what
So, sorry, Jesse. So, like, what would you say the role of play, sort of relative to Jungian analysis? I'm thinking of like sandbox, but I'm not sure what you would say. So, the role of play and how that relates to kind of direct experience, maybe something like analysis.
Yeah, I think it's a very good model or process for relativizing the conscious ego. I mean, when we play, we become engaged, and we're not necessarily split anymore into doer and the watcher of the doing. And so we're fully engaged. It kind of is a way to bypass the ego, so to speak. I mean, both for us as adults and for children, when we're deeply engaged in something, that's obvious to anyone who's working on it, and it's clear that they're fully engaged on both an internal level, and if it's play or manipulating something in the world, there's a kind of a oneness there or a lack of separation between the two. And also play is very symbolic. Sometimes we can understand about what the psyche's up to by looking at what we're playing at. Like, as you said, Anderson, sand tray work is an important aspect of Jungian analysis. And again, this is an opportunity to manipulate symbols and get around some of the conscious rigidities. And it's a way to kind of reveal self to self.